So, I have frequently said that if you have a US military base in your country, then you are under US occupation. And often when I say this, it's met with indignation. You get Europeans and Australians like, no, we're not under US occupation, we're allies. And I always like to say, really? You sure about that? Let's have a look into this, shall we? First we'll just address Europe very quickly. Because the US military entered Europe during World War II and it never left. It then became NATO after the war, ostensibly as a defensive alliance. But long after the Soviet Union collapsed, 30 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, it's still there. It's still there and it's growing. That's not a the sort of thing you see from a defensive alliance. But anyway, we'll make a whole video on Europe later, because today we're going to talk about Australia. This has been one of the most requested videos I've had asked of me, so let's just jump into it without further ado, shall we? So I would argue that Australia is absolutely under US military occupation. And I've heard people think we're allies, but I would like to point out, do not confuse compliance with consent. If we demanded the US military bases to leave, they absolutely would not. And I can prove that because there is an instance in Australian history where exactly that happened. This man is Gough Whitlam, one of the most famous Australian prime ministers of all time. He's very famous because he tried to break away from all the empires, from the British Empire and from the US Empire. So he came to power when the Labor Party won in 1972, and this is the very end of the Vietnam War, which, for those who don't know, Australia was heavily involved with. And we had all the same problems that America had. We had the protests, we had the conscription. It was very unpopular, and it really started to hurt this narrative people had about communism, like communism and the domino effect, and it's coming to take over all these countries. And we got to see firsthand that that wasn't true. And that changed the narrative. And that allowed someone like Gough Whitlam, who was, as far as Australian prime ministers are concerned, was very progressive. He was very left-wing, and he sought to get independence from the US and Britain. And this really alarmed the US government. There was one specific thing that Whitlam challenged that caused a huge divide between America and Australia. And America has a lot of military bases in Australia. It has ever since World War II, but there are two bases in particular that have been very contentious and are still contentious to this day. One of them is Pine Gap and the other is the Naranga military base. Both of them are allegedly CIA and NSA operation headquarters. They're basically black sites for all sorts of nefarious US military things. And both of these bases were under direct military control. Australia had no control over this, and this is something that Whitlam directly challenged. He said, look, Americans, if you want to be in our country as allies, we want joint share of these sites. And the CIA basically told Whitlam to go to hell. And by 1974, Whitlam finds out that ASIO and the CIA have been working together to monitor his government because it is particularly left-wing and socialist-leaning. This is a scandal at the time, and the ASIO head Barber is fired over it. And that was his attempt to try and contain the situation, but the more they dug on it, the more they found out that the CIA had its tendrils in all sorts of parts of the Australian government. And there were a whole bunch of Australian politicians that were being funded by the CIA to either monitor Whitlam or undermine him. They famously had these bank accounts called the Nugget Hand bank accounts. You can go look that up. So by March 1975, the divide between America and Whitlam is really growing. And Whitlam directly tells the CIA and America to stop interfering in Australian politics. He even goes so far as to say he's going to start reviewing these US military bases and possibly even ending their contracts and kicking them out of the country. In June 1975, the US ambassador, a guy called James Green, secretly meets with the Governor General John Kerr. He will be a very important person in this story. And they allegedly start to discuss ways that they could get rid of Gough Whitlam. In October 1975, apparently, I'm always going to say allegedly, Whitlam finds out about this CIA plan to get rid of his government, and he goes to consult the Governor General Kerr about this, and he, of course, denies the whole thing. By November 1975, this thing starts gaining a lot of speed, and Whitlam finds out on November 11th that Kerr plans to sack him. And at first he doesn't take this seriously because that has never happened before. The Governor General is, of course, if you don't know the Australian governmental system, that's the Queen's representative in Australia. And he apparently does have the power of the Queen to interfere in our politics, but that has never happened before. It's always meant to be a ceremonial role. So when Whitlam finds out that Kerr is planning to sack him, at first he dismisses it, he thinks it's silly. But later that day at like 4:30 p.m, Kerr makes the announcement that he's sacking the entire Gough Whitlam government, and he's going to replace them not only with just other people, but opposition people. So the other party, the Liberal Party, who's led by Malcolm Fraser at the time, who I've actually met, by the way, and he becomes a new caretaker PM. So effectively what's happened is a coup. Like the CIA, allegedly, has gone and made all of these channels through Australian politics and interfered directly in Australian politics, undermined democracy, and this socialist-leaning, not cooperative Australian government is then overthrown in a CIA coup. It is, of course, disguised as looking like it is something from the Crown, but you've got to remember that Britain is also in the same boat of it as Australia. At this point, the CIA and America are all over British politics as well at this point, so it's not like they have much say in it either. Anyway, so in this exact moment, this is that same day, November 11, 1975, Gough Whitlam leaves the Australian Parliament, and there's this throng of reporters outside, and he has a very, 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 very famous quote where he says, "May God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor-General." It's a strong quote. Of course, it's nonsense. There are no repercussions for any of the people really in this story. They are, again, protected by the US. And it is important to note that from this exact date, November 11, 1975, no Australian government has ever gone against American wishes. We are always now 100% subservient and compliant with every single American wish, to the point that we follow American foreign policy 100% of the time in every single way. If you're looking at this from the outside, and let's take it with a grain of salt and just say it is a weird coincidence that the Australian government always 100% does whatever America says, maybe it is just a coincidence, but I suspect it is not. And that's why I like to point out that you should not confuse compliance with consent. Do not get it twisted. If we told the US bases to leave, I guarantee you they would not. They would coup us again if any government tried to stop them. So yes, as I'm always pointing out in all these videos, the US empire is everyone's problem, including US allies. Anyway, fun side note and anecdote to wrap this one up with. I once had a conversation with Kim Beazley, who was the former Labour leader, and this is in like 2002 for my school newspaper. And I asked him directly, what would you do to stop US interference in our politics? And it is the only question I asked him that he completely dismissed and asked me to just move on to another question. And I think that is very telling. Anyway, so yes, us Australians are just as occupied as any other country, and it is important to remember that compliance does not mean consent. Anyway, something interesting to think about.